So the issue is that if you can't measure it, perhaps you're not going to be able to manage it, whatever the goal is that you're trying to achieve from a urban design point of view, a planning point of view, what have you. And so as we've seen, I think throughout the course, a lot is going on in many different fields, that many of the principles of sustainable urbanism, by any other name, are becoming best practice. There's a lot of concern about ecological impacts, obviously the climate change issue, and also other economic forces, fuel prices right now, market demand, demographic changes, people wanting to live in a more walkable, livable kind of neighborhood. And the market demand is growing for those kinds of places. And there are reforms in zoning and other kinds of codes and other kinds of changes in the laws that are likely to drive the new responses. But we still have a huge issue about implementation. So we need to understand what are the mechanisms for implementation, things like zoning changes and so on, regulatory reforms, barriers that we need to remove, new measurement tools, dealing with local politics and political feasibility, which can vary a great deal, of course, economic and social issues. And then what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk, the changes in the kinds of tools that we have, especially the certification tools and the forms of metrics that we're using that often are used in codes, for example, when we're doing things like form-based coding and other kinds of codes. And as we talked about before, there are some momentous framework agreements in the last few years that have been made. The Sustainable Development Goals, I know we've talked about those, the Paris Climate Accord, and then the one that we probably talked about the most, the Habitat 3 conference and the New Urban Agenda. Again, 193 countries have adopted that as the urbanization framework for the next 20 years. So that is a landmark agreement, to be sure. And then the Sustainable Development Goals, which are more specifically organized as goals that we're trying to achieve, we're trying to implement. And the one on cities and communities, goal 11 in particular. And goal 11 actually has a number of targets that break down what it's trying to achieve within the overall goal. And then the indicators within each of those targets about how we can measure whether we're achieving the goal or not, which again is going to be essential if we're going to be able to make progress. If we're moving in the wrong direction, we can say, wait a minute, we've got to change the way we're doing things or whatever. And so, you know, target 11.7, for example, is talking about universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces. So the public space agenda is looming large there, as it is in the New Urban Agenda. And then the indicator that says, well, we need to make sure that there is a amount of open space that's available for everybody, regardless of, you know, what their sex is, their age, disabilities, income, whatever, and that we need to make sure everybody has access to some public space. So that means also that it has to be close by, that it has to be well distributed, not just one big park that nobody or a lot of people can't get to. And so what we looked at was how do you disaggregate all the variables that are components of that? Obviously, parks are one of them. Natural areas, maybe those are more remote, things that are closer by, little pocket parks and so on. The pattern of distribution, that really matters. You know, again, if you have big stuff that's far away and hard to get to. And then we also need to think about the street network as part of the public space system, the whole, you know, the ways that we connect ourselves through the street systems and the plazas and the other public spaces, hardscape public spaces throughout the city. All of that together constitutes a kind of interconnected system or interconnected network that we have to think about it that way. We have to measure it that way. So we have to measure not only quantity, but quality, the qualities of the open public space, whether it's safe, inclusive, accessible, green, whatever that means. And then the tagging that qualitative data to the public space, we can disaggregate information using tools like GIS, for example, to find out whether people, what the statistics are on crime in particular public spaces, what the statistics are on how well people feel, the degree to which people feel safe in certain public spaces and not others. The green open space, not just hardscape, but vegetation, as we saw, biophilia is very important. And then universally accessible, are there barriers? Are there barriers to certain population, like those in wheelchairs and so on? But also to other people who may be mobility impaired or the elderly or so on. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but here's a methodology that we looked at, how you would use a sampling method using large scale satellite data and begin to try to tease out whether a given city or neighborhood has good quality public space, and looking at the different blocks and the medians of all blocks. And again, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on this, but it just goes to show you that when you're teasing these out, the methodology starts to be really important, so that you're using consistent data, you're using apples to apples, and you're not commingling different kinds of data or different kinds of measurements, not only within a given city, but within different cities. And this is a huge problem around the world because, of course, people use different metrics, literally different metric systems, the English and the metric measurement system and so on. So we have to have ways of putting that all into the same language and the same kind of measurement methodology. Again, more of the details of that, how they're looking at percentage of built up area that's open space in public use, not just say drivable surface for cars. We need the walkable space that the public can access, and then we measure that. And so when we were looking at this, we did a high-level political forum side event called Quantifying the Commons with our partners at UN Habitat. And we were looking at how we would use some of the remote sensing methodology and then essentially ground truth that methodology with open source or crowdsourced methods, have people go out on the ground and use maybe OpenStreetMap or other methodologies like that, where you can recognize that spaces are truly accessible, or maybe they're not, and you can't see that from the satellite. There's a big, drop-offs or something like that that isn't obvious from the satellite data. Also, other patterns of form of adjacent activities, mixed use, width of sidewalk, frequency of entrances, all those kinds of things that you can't necessarily see or see accurately in the remote sensing or the satellite or GIS data. And then breaking down the distribution and types of public space, or how much of it's streets, squares, parks, and so on, and how equitable is it distributed? Are there public space deserts within the city that some people don't have any access to public space? It's often the case. And then what about the diverse populations? Are women excluded, or disabled, different income groups? Are tourists crowding out the locals? That's a common problem as well. And then the social surveys of patterns of activity and exclusion that you wouldn't necessarily get from any other means. You really have to go out and interview the people. And our colleague Seth Lowe has developed a tool called the Toolkit for Ethnographic Survey of Space. That is a simplified method that anybody can use for that kind of social survey. And you need that simple methodology. You need to bring it down to a simple methodology, a kind of public space scorecard. And that's very much what some of the other metrics that are out there. You probably heard of Walk Score, which is uses an algorithm to calculate the proximity of destinations and the general conditions for walkability. Sometimes the results are really not good because they don't have the remote sensing, or they're only now they don't have the ground truthing, and they're only now beginning to get some of that ground truthing built into the Walk Score methodology. And then LEAD and D, which I'll talk about more later, and you saw in the reading, which is a method for neighborhood development, for making more walkable mixed use communities at the neighborhood scale. And then, of course, there's a technical challenge in all of that. What is the methodology? Do you have access to good data in the satellite information or other data sets? Some places have great data, others have very weak data, and that's a problem. There's the political challenge, as I said before. Sometimes it's feasible, sometimes it's not feasible, not palatable. We'll discuss all that later. So another issue that I think is a really obviously one that's on our minds, but also is one that informs us about a lot of other issues, is the question of greenhouse gas emissions and the connection to urban form. And it's actually an area that I did my own dissertation research in, because not only is it a critical issue, but it's an issue that is sort of the ultimate systems problem. You know, it involves so many aspects of our civilization, our industry, our transportation, everything else. These are the typical greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And again, you've got to be careful about apples to apples here. Is this consumption based, or, you know, is it, which is what the metric that I prefer to use, and not just looking at regions that happen to be high producers of things like fuels, but actually the consumers who are demanding it, where are they and how much are they demanding per capita, I think is the more meaningful metric. And it's not only carbon dioxide, it's methane, it's nitrous oxide, a number of other gases as well. And you can see the breakdown there. And then the breakdown by sector of which one is contributing. And again, you got to be careful about how you're defining that, how you're measuring it. But generally speaking, buildings are the biggest factor by a pretty large magnitude, which is one of the reasons that people have been focusing so much on the building scale. And they're right to do that, although it's worth pointing out that the buildings are inescapably embedded into a broader urban fabric that has a lot to do with how much the buildings actually use. Are they connected to geothermal heat sources, for example? Well, if they're scattered far apart, they probably aren't. If they're, or you know, steam heat systems, much more efficient systems like in some of the Nordic countries. Do you guys have steam heat? Do they use that here? Yeah, centralized heating systems. That requires a certain density to be able to achieve that. And so, and then breaking that down even further into residential buildings, commercial buildings, et cetera, and, you know, disaggregating some of the variables and where the demand actually lies. But also, again, I think we have to look at where the system-wide and the urban-wide patterns are driving the consumption, operating as a system, because it is, as my colleague Diana Erger-Vorsatz pointed out, that we can't just focus on the individual energy-using device. You know, we have to look at the systems that they operate in and the patterns of behavior and activity. And we have to look not only at greenhouse gas emissions, but the other sort of factors that are contributing to, for example, climate change, albedo effects, deforestation, and other factors. And also, not only is climate change an issue, but of course, we have other ecological challenges and challenges of resources, the depletion of resources that is unsustainable in many respects, the degradation and destruction of ecologies that we are ultimately going to depend upon, if they're fisheries and if they're, you know, other kinds of, you know, pollinators for our agriculture and so on, honeybees, and many other ecological systems that provide ecological benefits, ecosystem services, as they're referred to. And then obviously contamination and pollution related to that, that is degrading the ecologies and also degrading human health, degrading water quality and other things. So those are all factors that I think we have to look at as part of a broader challenge of sustainability or unsustainability. And then I think we have to look even more broadly at the systemic failures in our institutions, the inability to to achieve the reforms that we need. In many cases, we know what we need to do, but actually making the changes is getting harder and harder, especially when we're arguing about even the basic facts and the problems we're having with social media and other forms of knowledge curation that seem to be breaking down in many ways, that we can't, to whatever extent we had it before, we're losing, or at least some people will argue that we are losing the ability to operate on a shared set of facts about the world, shared set of understanding about the world. And science is not a perfect field of inquiry and knowledge, obviously, but I think we could, very easily say that there's some kind of a curve, right? And this is where there's pretty settled science, and over here is maybe the sort of obscure stuff, or maybe it's a long tail, you could draw it like this. And this is the fringe theories that are maybe completely out of the mainstream and probably completely wrong. Although sometimes these do become mainstream, like plate tectonics, which once way over here, and now plate tectonics is understood as the mainstream. So, we are dealing with a process of approaching certainty, but never achieving it. We're always dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and that's certainly true for sustainability. We can be certain about that. Let me just unpack that a little more and talk about the issue of density. Urban density clearly has a major role in creating efficiencies and reducing greenhouse gas emissions per capita. And there are many charts like this one that show a strong correlation between urban density and greenhouse gas emissions. The higher the density, the lower the emissions per capita. This happens to be in transportation, or in motor spirit use per person, it's called. But I can show you many other charts that are very similar on different other metrics of energy use and resource use and so on. But what you'll notice also is that the curve sort of bends outward as it goes. It sort of flattens out, this kind of hockey stick shape, so that by the time you go from, say, Manila to Hong Kong, you're going from 200 persons per hectare to 300 persons per hectare, but you're not getting any difference really in the energy used per person. And that's true in all of these metrics. You'll see that it's kind of flattening out of the curve. So there's kind of a sweet spot here of somewhere around 100 persons per hectare or so, 150 maybe, where it begins to taper off and you don't get as many benefits from density. So that's an important observation, I think. And then if you look, for example, at, come on, advanced slide. There we go. At the mix of elements, that matters too. It's not just the density. You could imagine a scenario where there's a very dense residential area and then a very dense commercial area, and everybody's driving back and forth between those two and consuming all kinds of energy and not being efficient at all, right? The mix is actually a major benefit as well. And even at a lower density, if you have a good mix, it can be better than a higher density without the mix. So it's not just density, it's integrated functions. The functions are all well organized with respect to one another, that have organized complexity, as we talked about before. And then there are other components of the density advantage that we can see. Clearly, there's reduced infrastructure construction and maintenance, distribution losses, loss of water from leakage, and so on, district energy and cogeneration, more compact building morphologies, because you're now at a more compact format. And then smaller homes on average related to that, often the inverse relationship to real estate prices in the more central areas, that are driving, the economics is driving smaller and more efficient units. Lower paving per person, increased urban vegetation per person. If you do increase the vegetation, that helps a lot. A little harder to do when you're more dense, but if you are able to reduce the paving, you can potentially increase the vegetation. And then the outdoor amenities that encourage low carbon activities like walking and so on. And then harder to quantify is the aesthetic character of these kinds of places. We talked about biophilia before, and that importance of compact, walkable urbanism. But then there are disadvantages to density. Some of the energy effects are things like heat island effects. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's the idea that you're increasing the amount of heat that's being trapped from pavement and from roofscapes and other things. You're generating more heating in that area. That in turn requires more air conditioning and more energy for dealing with that problem. The morphology matters. There are certain kinds of building forms that are more efficient than others. The long stretched out buildings or tall stretched out buildings tend to be less efficient because of the exposed surfaces to the floor plate. The ratio is increased. And then the prevalence of exposure to high sun and wind, for example, with big glass curtain walls and so on, and taller buildings that tend to have greater energy loss and gain from the urban morphology, from the building morphology. And then the embodied energy, especially in tall buildings where you need more steel, more concrete, you need to stiffen the building, you need to and potentially have more egress, more stairwells and so on. So you're losing the effective area of square footage that you would need otherwise. And you end up with a smaller yield of usable floor area as a result. Other urban effects, obviously there's shading problems if you're trying to get sun and you've got buildings that are adjacent to each other and blocking off the sun in areas where it's cooler and you want the sun, maybe you want the shading in other climates. But then also wind effects, especially as taller buildings, as I was saying, not only the wind effects at the building itself, but the effects that the building produces down at the ground level, the Venturi effect and other sort of wind-driven effects. And then the scale of place at the street, if you're losing the sort of human scale because you've got monumental buildings all around you, that can matter. That can make it a less desirable place to walk and to be in public spaces and gather, and it'll make less active public spaces potentially. At least that'll be a contributor to that. There are many other factors too, of course. And then the distribution of people, you know, at a certain point, density is good if you have a lot of people around and a lot of people coming down to the street and activating it. But if they're all in tall buildings, then the tall buildings act like vertical cul-de-sacs. There are some examples where the owners of the condominium units in tall buildings use the garage for their car. So they go from their living unit down to the garage, get in their car, drive away, never even get out onto the street, never activate the street. So obviously that isn't helping you from an urban point of view to activate the street and to make it more lively. So those are some of the impacts when it comes to the diseconomies of density. And again, I think there's a sweet spot there that we can find. Certainly density is a big benefit, but it's a little like aspirin. You know, you take a couple of aspirins for a headache. You say take one aspirin, that's pretty good, and take another aspirin, it's maybe twice as good. Is 100 aspirin 100 times better? Not necessarily. So there's a Goldilocks principle at work there, I think. So then there are other mechanisms, you might say, to create incentives for settlement efficiency that are now being looked at. Things like cap and trade is one idea for trading carbon. Taxing carbon is another. Tradable development rights, you've probably heard about those, TDRs, transferable development rights. Credit for infrastructure, if you're doing green energy projects and getting credit for that. rating and certification programs. I'm going to come back to that with LEED and D. Various kinds of direct pricing mechanisms, congestion pricing, where you charge more when people are, when the traffic is higher and people have to come into town, they have to pay that charge. Carbon taxes, I mentioned, road tolls, etc. And then I'll give you an example of one of these. This is in California. A couple of years ago, they introduced two bills. This was Assembly Bill 32, which had a regulatory market mechanism for reduction of greenhouse gases. It set the requirements. It's essentially set a cap, and then it said we will give you incentives to achieve that, to help achieve that cap. A long-range goal of 80% by 2050, and that is a very ambitious goal, but they're working hard to achieve it. And then the Air Resources Board is tasked with implementing that. And the scoping plan includes a cap and trade system, incentives for going to renewables like solar and wind, transportation related greenhouse gases are regulated and reduced through things like smog control and so on, and more efficient fuels and reduction of driving. And then there's language about making places more walkable, better public transportation, rail, and so on, and gives the metropolitan planning organizations the ability to adopt a sustainable community strategy growth scenario. That means the urban planning. And funding decisions can be tied to these growth scenarios. And then it's controversial because it relies on the local implementation, and that varies a lot. And sometimes the suburban jurisdictions have a financial incentive to say, hey, come out and build in our jurisdiction, and we won't make you do all these other things that the inner cities are doing, and we'll get more money out of it. So that's going on also. Then the greenhouse gases are tied to regional land use. As I said before, the regional planning agencies are tasked with creating the plans to meet the targets. Even if they're in conflict with the local plans, they're at least creating a framework plan, and then requiring regional transportation to be consistent. Again, not throwing all their money into automobile-based transportation, but funding for other transportation choices, for walking, for biking, for getting around in public transportation, and tying it to housing policies. I think that's really important. You know, it's not just an affordable house anywhere. It's an affordable house that also has affordable transportation nearby that you can walk, and if you need to, you can take transportation of various kinds. And then there's some other technical stuff that I won't go into. There are various exemptions and streamlinings. Basically, what that means is that we'll cut the red tape for your projects, and California is notorious for its red tape. Senate Bill 375 does something similar. It provides loopholes for feasible measure. It relies on incentives, especially the streamlining of the air quality requirements and some of the other regulatory requirements. If you do mixed use, if you do transit priority projects, you get the streamlining. You might not have to do the CEQA review. You may not have to meet local or project specific greenhouse gas impact standards because you're already doing this thing that they think is going to achieve those goals, and may also waive the limits on growth inducement. And then prioritizing projects that achieve mixed use, that have only 50% residential and a minimum density of 20 dwelling units per acre. That's about 50 per hectare. So it's, you know, below where we were talking about before, but at least in that direction. Transit priority projects that, and then a floor area ratio of 0.75. That means that the 75% of the lot is covered at the ground floor, and if a taller building, you can cover less of the area. That's a pretty low coverage, actually. Then again, I'm going into the weeds here, and I don't mean to glaze your eyes with all this, but there are limits to the CEQA exemptions that are loopholes that are not great. There's a lot of controversy about that. You can do any of the following. You could stick 5 acres of open space in the middle of your project and so on. All of that is just to make the point that often these regulations are in effect closing the barn door after the horse has gone, or they are creating so many loopholes that they're not really going to be effective. And that's because of the political compromises that are necessary in order to pass the legislation, frankly. So those are, I would say, very difficult strategies trying to deal with the regulatory environment, especially when you're trying to essentially reduce the regulatory burden on projects as an incentive to do good projects. Maybe it's better to find market-based incentives to do the good projects in the first place, rather than say, hey, we'll cut you some slack and let you do projects that are more in line with what we're saying. But again, it is a way forward that I think is important to talk about and think about how we deal with the regulation. And I'm going to talk about this not tomorrow, but the next day, this whole question of how do we change the system, create real reform at a large scale, because we've got agreements at many scales. Many people say, yes, we know what we need to do, but we're still a long way from actually implementing these changes because the system still rewards business as usual. There's still too much reliance on currently feasible and business as usual and so on. So let me talk now a little bit about some of the rating systems that are out there. It's a really interesting subject, and it's a fast changing world. In fact, right now, probably a lot of these are obsolete already since I compiled this list, but there are a number of these that are sustainable development indicators. Here's 15 of them that you can see as examples that essentially try to make holistic assessments of the sustainability of different components, building components and so on. You probably heard of life cycle assessments, ecological footprint analysis, many other versions of that, specific reviews, the Stern review a number of years ago, and so on. And then I'm going to take you through a couple of specific examples of different rating systems. Here's one called Green Globes, which is a Canadian system similar to LEED. Are you familiar with LEED? Yeah, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. One Planet Living, which was developed by the World Wildlife Fund and its partners, that tries again to look at a holistic assessment of how do you reduce the ecological footprint that we have on the world that is clearly unsustainable right now. We don't have 3 Earths, let alone 5 Earths, as we would need for Europeans or North Americans. And so it goes through and it looks at the different categories of, for example, reducing carbon to 0, ultimately reducing waste to 0, thinking about waste as part of a cycle, the life cycle of materials. Also, some other categories that are not as common to these kinds of environmental assessments, things like culture and heritage, much more intangible and perhaps important also, and even health and happiness. Seems like maybe a slippery category to be describing, but there are ways to quantify that through social surveys and other things. And rising wealth and greater health and happiness increasingly diverge. You can see, for example, in a lot of the studies that above a certain level of wealth, happiness and well-being don't really increase much at all, if at all. Sometimes they go down, actually. And that's an interesting finding. If we're more concerned about health and happiness than we are just about abstract numbers, maybe we need to look at that more carefully. Sustainable transport, obviously a big category. Local and sustainable materials, another big category. Local and sustainable food, a huge factor in greenhouse gas emissions and in other impacts that we're having on the landscape and on water and so on. Sustainable water is another category. Protecting natural habitats and wildlife. There's culture and heritage I mentioned before. Equity and fair trade, another category. And then health and happiness, the one I mentioned before. Our biggest challenge this new century is to take an idea that seems abstract, sustainable development, and turn it into a reality for all the world's people. And yes, that is indeed the challenge. This is a UK system called BREEAM, which is developed by the Building Research Establishment in the UK. And they look at these different categories, 8 different categories: climate change and energy, community, placemaking, transport and movement, ecology, resources, business, and buildings. And I won't go through a lot of detail here. I'll send you the slides if you're interested, or you can Google it as well. The different issues, and they ask questions about each one. What are they looking at? What are the issues that each one of these is assessing? Here's another one called Carbon Footprints. It's essentially an ecological footprint tool that is from the UK, that looks at things like housing footprint per capita, transport footprint per capita, and so on. You can see many of these footprint calculators along with greenhouse gas calculators on the web. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them are very uneven, but this is one example. And then I wanted to talk about this one because I'm going to talk about it more in the next couple of lectures, and that is the Charter of the New Urbanism. I mentioned it before when I was talking about the New Urban Agenda, and the fact that the New Urban Agenda is in many ways the mirror image of the SIAM Charter, of the Charter of Athens from 1933. And the Charter of the New Urbanism is also a mirror image of the SIAM Charter. In many ways, it's a precursor to the New Urban Agenda, as I've argued and pointed out in some of my own research. I don't know how familiar you are. We've talked about new urbanism, and there's variations on it. There are many people who talk about what one might think of as new urbanism by any other name: walkability, mixed use, diversity of transportation, other things. Those are the principles that are identified in the Charter of the New Urbanism. And if they don't want to call it new urbanism, I don't really think it matters, frankly. But certainly a lot of people have sort of convened around the particular identity of the new urbanism, which was an American movement started in 1991, began in a conference in the Ahwahnee Lodge of the Yosemite National Park, convened by the governor of California at that time, Jerry Brown, who convened what was called the Local Government Commission, later spun off as an independent entity, to bring together a number of architects and planners, 6 in particular, who later went on to found the Congress for the New Urbanism. And it was all about ecological principles of urban design. How do we get a handle on this runaway sprawl that we're seeing in California and so many other places, which is clearly unecological and not sustainable? So the charter actually has a preamble. This is the preamble. I'll take you through the details of it in a minute. And then it has 3 major sections at different scales: the regional scale, the neighborhood and district scale, and then the block, street, and building scale. And in each one of these, there are 9 specific elements, 27 total. So taking you through some of the specifics of that, it's really about controlling sprawl, recognizing that sprawl is a runaway process that is really not serving anybody's interest, except maybe the short-term interest of people who are building it. And that's not sufficient. We need a more sustainable model. Reconfiguration of sprawling suburbs into communities of real neighborhoods and diverse districts. the conservation of natural environments, and the preservation of our built legacy. So we've got to restructure public policy and development practices to follow those principles: diversity of neighborhoods and use and population, design for the pedestrian and transit as well as the car, shaped by physically defined and universally accessible public spaces and community institutions, framed by architecture and landscape design that celebrate local history, climate, ecology, and building practice. Pretty universal principles, not particularly controversial, I would say. But there is this idea that, well, you can't have environmental determinism. You know, you designers are always trying to control everything through the design. Well, they recognize explicitly physical solutions by themselves are not going to address these problems. But on the other hand, you can't address these problems without a coherent and supportive physical framework. So it's part of a constellation of things that we need to do. And we need to do it as a collaborative process, a broad-based citizenry, public and private sector leaders, and so on, reestablishing the relationship between the art of building and the making of community, and very aspirational, and trying to, you know, really reclaim this runaway process into something more sustainable and more durable and more desirable from a human point of view. So I won't go into every one of these categories, but the region talks about metropolitan regions having geographic boundaries related to the ecology, the watersheds, and so on. It's a fundamental economic unit. It has a fragile relationship to its agrarian hinterland, and that needs to be preserved. Development patterns shouldn't blur or eradicate the edges. We need strategies to encourage infill development over peripheral expansion. We need to develop contiguous to urban boundaries wherever possible. If we have to do non-contiguous development, it should be done as towns and villages, not as monocultural, you know, bedroom communities or whatever. Respect historical patterns, precedents, and boundaries, broad spectrum of public and private uses, supporting a framework of transportation alternatives, and sharing the resources cooperatively among the municipalities, and sharing the planning authority to some degree, planning in more regional ways. Neighborhood scale, very important, of course, because so much goes on at the neighborhood scale, the walkability and so on. Pedestrian friendly, mixed use, compact. Districts are sometimes more single use, a university, whatever, and still should follow the principles of neighborhood design to the extent possible. Activities of daily living within walking distance. That's the 15-minute city idea. And giving independence to those who do not drive, those who can't drive for whatever reason. Broad range of housing types and price levels, transit corridors properly planned and coordinated, building densities and land uses within walking distance of transit. Obviously, you need to bring the people closer to the transit. Embedded civic, institutional, and commercial activity within the neighborhoods and districts, not into segregated districts that are isolated and that shut down at 5 p.m. every day and become dangerous. We want people to be able to get to these places easily. We can have graphic urban design codes that are going to help us to do those things, and that's going to be important as well. Go back here. There we go. And then a range of parks, large, medium, and small, so that people can walk to them, including, pocket parks, tot lots, and so on. Keeping conservation and open lands. So nothing particularly controversial about any of that. Then you get to the block, the street, and the building scale. A primary task of all urban architecture and landscape design is the physical definition of streets and public spaces as places of shared use. Now that is controversial among some people because there's the idea that architecture is really about the object and that you should create more of a, the tower in the park model, which is really a core idea of the SEAM or the superblock model, where you have essentially an entire super block area that's only pedestrian, and then the cars are at the edges of that or underneath that or whatever. That was seen at the time as being a more rational solution. But what this is saying is, no, you really need to go back to the model of buildings enclosing and defining public spaces and creating the interaction between the public and the private that's so critical in cities. And those architectural projects should be seamlessly linked to their surroundings. And this issue transcends style. That was a very controversial phrase when it was introduced. I think the point of it is not that the configuration doesn't matter, the geometry doesn't matter, the details at the human level don't matter, but that it isn't that you must do one style or another style or another style. It's that you need to achieve the goals with the geometries of the building, with the style of the building, whatever that may be. And it can be enormously varied, of course. But you might end up with a blank wall in one style, and the problem is not, oh, you have the wrong style. The problem is you have a blank wall, right? So that's the way we need to be thinking of these things. The revitalization of the urban spaces depends on safety and security. We have to recognize that, that we still want to maintain accessibility and openness. And part of the way that we're going to do that is to have more eyes on the street, more people around us to make us feel safer and to actually achieve greater safety. And there's been a lot of work on that showing that that does, in fact, help enormously. You can't always rely on that. You do have to have some, obviously, some enclosures, some fences, some gates, some hardening of the buildings. Obviously, we all lock our doors typically and so on. We don't just let anybody wander into our private bedroom. So there is some control of spatial territories that has to go on. In the contemporary metropolis, development must adequately accommodate automobiles. In other words, we're not trying to get rid of automobiles just yet. We recognize that there are needs for people to get around in that mode. The disabled person who needs a van with a wheelchair lift, for example, and so on. So, but we're trying to integrate those into the walkable mixed modal transportation area. Streets and squares should be properly configured to encourage walking. Architecture and landscape design should grow from local climate, topography, history, and building practice. A little bit controversial. Some people have a more sort of globalist, you know, the international style was an example of that you just go with universal principles and that's good enough. But I think there's evidence that local identity does matter. It matters to the population, and we're serving the population. So civic buildings and public spaces require important sites. You've got to include those. Buildings should provide their inhabitants with a clear sense of location, weather, and time. We shouldn't be in these giant, deep planned buildings where we have no idea what time of day it is, or whether the sun is out or it's raining or anything else. We need to be connected to the outside as much as possible when we're in buildings. And then preservation and renewal of historic buildings, districts, and landscapes affirms the continuity and evolution of urban society. So those are the 27 principles, and they're pretty common sense, I would say, not particularly controversial, although they do run against the grain of some of the CM principles, as we talked about before, the idea that you're not going to mix modes, that you're going to segregate the modes and only have you know, the vehicular modes at high speed and get the pedestrians away from that, get the pedestrians actually into, you know, park-like swoopy landscapes and so on, create super blocks, create tall buildings away from the street and so on. This is going in some ways back to the older model of cities, the more universal model of cities, I think we would say today. And that brings me to lead in D, which is, you know about leadership in energy and environmental design for buildings. This is for neighborhood development. And it was created by the US Green Building Council, as the original lead was, but also in partnership with the Congress for the New Urbanism, and there was one other partner, I think the National Resource Defense Council. And so this is, I gave you the reading, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but there's a number of categories where you essentially make a scorecard And if you're trying to get your project certified, it's similar to what you would do in a regular LEED building certification. You're required to provide documentation that you meet the prerequisites and or the credits. And the prerequisites are all required; they're mandatory. If you don't meet a prerequisite, you're no longer eligible for the certification. The credits you total up based upon how many you get. This is just like LEED for buildings. And if you have enough of those, you're going to get a score that determines whether you're gold, platinum, et cetera, in your level of certification. So there's smart location and linkage. In other words, you want an interconnected, you want lots of interconnected streets and so on. And again, urban extensions as much as possible. Neighborhood pattern and design. The diversity of the uses, the mixed use, the affordable housing mixed in, access to public spaces and so on. Then green construction and technology. This recapitulates a lot of what's in the LEED for buildings, and the different categories of energy systems in the buildings, historic buildings, adaptive reuse and so on. And other things too that are a bit more urban, things like heat island reduction, different kinds of energy management strategies, waste management strategies, and so on. And then there's a kind of catch-all category, innovation and design, that allows you to submit new innovations that your project has created that aren't maybe reflected in the other categories, and you get in effect bonus points for that. Then you total the whole thing up, and that determines what your level of certification is going to be. So it's a lot like the other LEED systems. You're probably familiar. There's a whole series of them. There's LEED for offices, LEED for renovations, et cetera. And this is LEED for neighborhood design. So it hasn't been as pervasive as LEED for buildings, partly because there aren't as many projects that are looking for this kind of certification. A building, you can put the plaque right on the front door and everybody sees it, and the tenants see it and so on. A neighborhood scale project, a master plan community or whatever, it's a little harder to understand how that's going to benefit them, other than, in a kind of philosophical sense. So I'm going to run through some of the other projects that are out there. It's amazing how many there are, actually, the different certification systems and the different metrics that they use. This is one that was originally created and supported by the EU, practical evaluation tool for urban sustainability, or PETUS. It uses a database and it brings together a lot of case studies, and then has a checklist and a matrix. And then just on and on, the number of these, absolutely dizzying number. I'm just going to scroll through some of these and you'll be amazed at how many different ones there are. Dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Some of these are obsolete already. There's new ones that have come online, but you can see that there's just a million of these, really. So what I think that tells us is that this is a dynamic subject, and it's a subject that a lot of people are concerned about and want to try to make progress in, but there's not a lot of coherence to it at this point. And I think that's one of the important things about the New Urban Agenda, is that here's a process that brings together 193 governments that essentially say, okay, we're going to move forward in this direction. It doesn't necessarily incorporate any of these other rating systems, but incorporates a lot of their ideas. For example, I talked at the beginning about the metrics for the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets and the indicators that in many ways reflect a lot of the metric approaches that come from these other methodologies. And then I think there's another promising area, which is the idea of combining some of these tools together into toolkits. And a number of people have done that as well. Here's some of the examples of that, where they bring together a whole series of metrics and charters and certifications and so on that try to document that. This is one my colleague and Portland developed that integrates a number of organizations, a number of systems, including LEAD-ND. This is criterion planning in Portland. And they have what they call a cool spot kit of parts, where you have the tools for regional accessibility, multimodal transportation, high density land use, mixed uses, building siting, district heating, clean generation, electric distribution grid, all of those things together. And for example, looking at, and I showed this slide before, not only the density of land use, but the mix of land use as a major component of reducing CO2. And so he calls these cool spots, where essentially you can identify based upon the methodology for assessing, and you could do this through an algorithm, through an automated process too, or through GIS, remote sensing, where you can actually find and grow, essentially improve the cool spots as he refers to them. You can find things that are already working well and enhance those. You can find things that are not working well and repair those, you know, if it's not walkable, for example, or it doesn't have access to parks or green space or whatever. And so this is an example that he gives of how you can grow a cool spot over time. You can like build a pedestrian and bike network, you can increase transit density, you can expand district heating and cooling and so on. All these different components of sustainable urbanism that you can address within a system, within a kind of toolkit approach. And here's how you can score that, and you can see how you're doing with high carbon versus low carbon. He's looking at greenhouse gas emissions in particular. So that's a kind of whirlwind tour of a lot of different metrics and certification programs that are out there. It's been a while since I've compiled that list, so there's a lot more I know, but that's probably plenty to start with and to discuss. So we have about maybe another 10 minutes or so. You want to, and by the way, hi, you just came in, right?
Yes, I apologize. As a matter of fact, I just realized about your lecture today, sir. And I took this information from Professor Zabula.
Great.
Just let me know about this, and I'm more than eager to participate in such a
Great. Okay. Well, you know, we have this thing that you guys are supposed to sign, by the way.
Okay.
So I'll do that right now. And then I'll sign it when you're done. And yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating how much is happening, and yet a lot of it's very sort of chaotic, I would say, at the moment, and a lot of efforts that have stalled out for a number of reasons, especially the economic forces are very limiting in what they can allow in many cases, because, you know, if something, and this is something that I think we as designers and planners need to do a better job of dealing with, is understanding the economics of our projects, and how if we are going to achieve success, if we're going to actually get something built, it's going to have to pencil. It's going to have to be economically viable, you know, and if not, then we're not going to be successful in getting that project built. So Anna, do you want to comment on, you know?
Sure. Well, one thing that I realized once upon a time, a while ago, I happened to be a judge in a competition for the best master thesis in the field of architecture, as I got the recognition the year before. And what I've noticed is that the carbon footprint topic is brought by many of students or newly made architects, but they seem not to realize the true meaning behind it. It's just a word to put on the design and magically make it better. And I can buy it. I really was shocked how much of the idea behind something very non-existing can be said, and the design itself doesn't really manifest the point, right? So I think that we are in this strange position where the carbon footprint, the environmental friendly buildings are just, this is a way to make profit, the greenwashing, this whole topic of greenwashing is there. And for me, the problem is that the people that are really, that are willing to make a change are in the low. They're not really, they're not leading. It's just a bunch of architects that are catching a word just to make it, I don't know, how shall I put it? I have to say that as a PhD student now, I'm on my 3rd year. I used to be an architect through every year of my education here. I was a practitioner. I got 10 plus years of being an architect, and I quit after that because I didn't really see any sense in my job.
You're a recovering architect.
Yes, I couldn't imagine me continuing that path because I was in on multiple offices, but all of them had the same issue. They had some kind of idea, but the project was not really supporting that. There was no meaning behind it, just producing utilitarian architecture, just driven by money. And it's for me, this was a place where I couldn't sit for long.
Yeah.
Apparently, I was there for 10 years, but now I said that enough is enough, right? And I'm willing just. What I'm doing now, hopefully, I never imagined being a scientist in any way, but for me, it's a way to make a change. Maybe even in my field of work, I know that this is hard. The application of the research is hard. We as architects, we have this manner of playing the role of God. We are trying to make vivid designs. They're not really supported by any studies, and I simply don't like it. I do not see the future in it. And I have many colleagues in many fields of science. I have a lot of my best friend is a radiologist, and when we talk about the progress in our fields, I have a feeling that in architecture it's not there. We are kind of stuck in a moment where we're not moving forward. And actually, I think what we're doing now, it's not anywhere near. It cannot be called a progress, right? So this is something that is in my mind for a long time, and I'm really willing and I'm hoping to see the change, but it's. I don't know if you have your idea on what's not working in this, why we don't have the connection between the interdisciplinary studies and what we do. I just cannot express enough how sad for me it is that we're as a group, as architects, we're just not making enough progress, right?
I think you're right, and I think, part of the problem is that architecture is embedded in a larger context where, for historical reasons, architecture became a kind of marketing arm for development, for real estate development, and became seduced, I would say, into playing that role because there was a lot of prestige in it. There was money in it, although not as much money as other fields, but certainly for the star architects, there was money and fame and glamour and all the rest of it. And I think a lot of young architects saw that and were attracted to that and thought, oh, well, this is the field for me. I want to be the next, Frank Gehry or whatever, Zaha Hadid. But I think also there is reform going on in the profession now. There is a debate going on in the profession, and I don't think it's all, one approach these days. And I would encourage you to at least participate in that in some way, even if it's externally. I myself, I decided not to go into a pure architecture profession, although I do practice, I do a lot of design work and project management work and urban planning work and then the academic career and everything else. But, I wanted to be part of the reform movement, if you will, and try to help push that forward if I could. And I think that's important because I think the problems we have in architecture are not just in architecture, they're in our sort of consumer-based society and the way we've allowed certain economics approaches, especially the short-term economic approach, to dictate everything that is going on in our world, in our professions. And we've sort of let it all run out of control. I think more and more people realize that we've, allowed some forces of dehumanization really to take over and to run roughshod over our lives. And Gropius said that, by the way. I was just reading a quote from Gropius back in the 1930s or 40s, where he basically said that. So this is not a new phenomenon, and a lot of architects, especially the more idealistic modernists like Gropius, a very humanistic person, saw this, and felt that what they were trying to do was a response to it. But of course, in a way, they made some other mistakes in terms of embracing the large scale and the industrial and the standardized components and all the rest of it, that now, luckily, our technology is allowing us to break free of that. Our sciences are allowing us to break free of that and to see new ways of doing things, new technologies and so on. So I think the profession is, personally, I think it's ripe for a kind of renaissance. And maybe that's overly optimistic on my part, but I do see these things happening historically, where a profession or a culture or a period in history becomes sort of stagnant and stuck in the past, so to speak, and then something happens where it sort of bursts out. It's an interesting point. The Renaissance occurred as a result of one cause was the Black Death, the plague in Europe. That we had a sort of ossified social and economic system in Europe that was sort of broken open by the plague and the Renaissance. And it's thought that one of the major factors in producing the Renaissance was that. So who knows? Maybe the coronavirus pandemic will, in some way, be a contributor to that. But anyway, you have thoughts as well? Anything you want to add or question or comment?
I was wondering if I have anything better to contribute to this.
Any questions about the lecture or anything that maybe a lot to think about, I'm sure.
I have to be humble. I know little to nothing about the urbanism itself, the designer, so we can discuss in a means of design and maybe psychology as well. But you're experienced man, and you've shared with us some observations, such as that globalization is maybe not the perfect tool for a good urbanism, because perhaps the times when design used to be some kind of a dictator are long time past to ourselves. So maybe there is time for a change, and I like it because in my doctoral dissertation I'm looking for the idea of open society in architecture of today, of the last 50 years. And I like the egalitarian approach. So, have you, sir, noticed any easily noticeable change for good, for better, in, for example, the environment of the democratic societies due to the change in architecture?
Right. Well, and that's what's interesting to me about science as a field, is that science is an open society. It's a process in which even patent clerk from Bern can revolutionize the field if he gets his paper published and it gets peer reviewed and enough people see it and understand what it is and so on. There was a really interesting research finding in the last few years about how bees make, honeybees make collective decisions. They basically function almost like democracies, or like they, when one part of the hive splits off and goes to look for a new place to locate, the scouts will all go out and look out, and then they'll come back to the hive and they'll do this dance, you know, like the dance they do to tell the other bees about where the honey or where the pollen is. But in this case, they're talking about where they should relocate, and they will dance more and more excitedly if they're really excited about a particular location. And so the other bees will go check that out. They'll peer review the bees, and they'll come back, and then they'll start quivering more or less depending on how good the site is and so on. And gradually they'll caucus up into these different populations, subpopulations that represent the different locations that are candidates. And the one that's like the most bees quivering the most, that's where they all go to. And it's the best choice. They've actually made decisions collectively about where to go as a result of this sort of open society that they have. So I think this whole question of how do we make the best decisions? How do we know? How do we form knowledge and verify the knowledge? How do we curate it and improve it is really important, and it's something that we're struggling with at the moment because we, you know, although I think our science is actually quite good at curating the knowledge and identifying, you know, there's always certain uncertainty. It's really in our political institutions and our cultural institutions, our consumer society, that we completely, anything goes, and we lose the ability to, you know, to share a lot of the effective knowledge, except maybe when we're using Wikipedia or something, which is another curated database. It's a very interesting process, the way that works. So anyway, I think this is a really important
So the
topic.
question is where the best pollen for us is, or the best honey is going to be produced. Is that People's Republic of China or maybe Kingdom of Denmark? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting to think about what the lessons would be, you know, for human societies, and, you know, the debates about democracy and its dangers and its failures goes back to Plato, you know, and so it's an old subject, an ancient subject really, but I think it's something that we're, you know, it comes down to how do groups make decisions? How do they decide what's true and what's actionable, what they're going to actually, you know, work on together? And whether it's, you know, we're really good at landing a flying helicopter on Mars, but we're not so good at, you know, dealing with sprawl, for example, or so anyway, but I think we can get better, and that's something that I hope comes through in this course.